The vast expanses of the Siberian taiga hide secrets that the authorities would prefer to forget forever. Abandoned gulag camps, many of which are still not marked on maps, bear traces of one of humanity's most terrible tragedies. We will embark on a journey through forgotten places, where nature is slowly engulfing the remains of barracks and barbed wire. Through declassified documents and eyewitness accounts, we will reveal the truth about the system that turned an entire country into a giant prison. Get ready to learn what has been kept silent for decades. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new investigations into the most mysterious pages of history. What do you think? Is it possible to fully restore the truth about the scale of the Gulag tragedy when so many documents have been destroyed and witnesses have passed away? Share your opinion in the comments. On June 27, 1929, a day that forever changed the fate of Russia. On that day, the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR adopted a resolution on the use of prison labor, which marked the beginning of the creation of the main camp administration, the Gulag. But few people know that the roots of this system go much deeper, into the darkest corners of revolutionary ideology. The idea of using forced labor to re-educate enemies of the people originated in the early years of Soviet power. Vladimir Ulyanov Lenin repeatedly mentioned in his works the need to create labor camps to combat freeloaders and parasites. However, the system only reached its true scale under Joseph Stalin, when the repressive apparatus became an integral part of the state machine. The first major experiment was the Solovetsky Special Purpose Camp, created on the basis of an ancient monastery in the White Sea. It was here that the methods were developed that would later be applied in the Siberian taiga. Prisoners were forced to cut down forests, build roads, and extract peat in conditions where only a few could survive. But why did Siberia become the main arena for this tragedy? The answer lies in its geographical location. The endless expanses of the taiga were an ideal natural prison. Escape from here was virtually impossible. The harsh climate, wild animals, and thousands of kilometers of impenetrable forests served as a more reliable barrier than any walls or barbed wire. The NKVD, led by Heinrich Jagoda, developed a detailed plan for the development of Siberian territories by prisoners. According to secret documents, declassified only in the 1990s, it was planned to create a whole network of camps, each of which was to become a self-sufficient production complex. The first camps in the Siberian taiga appeared as early as 1930. They were built in a hurry, without taking into account climatic conditions and basic survival standards. The barracks were hastily constructed wooden structures that were blown through by winter winds. Stove heating was a luxury. More often than not, prisoners kept warm only with their own breath and the warmth of their neighbors. The camp management system was modeled on the military. Each camp was headed by a chief from among the NKVD staff, who reported directly to Moscow. Under his command worked an entire army of guards, escorts, and technical specialists. It is noteworthy that many of them were former prisoners who had been released early for exemplary behavior. The paperwork in the camps is striking in its detail. Each prisoner was given a personal number, under which a detailed file was kept. Not only were details of the crime and sentence recorded, but also professional skills, health status, and even psychological characteristics. This information was used to assign prisoners to work brigades and determine the expediency of their detention. But the most sinister aspect of the system was its economic component. The Gulag was originally planned as a self-sustaining enterprise. Each camp was supposed to not only support itself, but also bring profit to the state. This requirement led to the creation of a veritable industry of death, where human life was valued solely in terms of production efficiency. What horrific secrets does this system hide? And how did the Siberian taiga witness one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century? Kolyma. This word became synonymous with horror for millions of Soviet citizens. But few people know that behind this name lies not just a geographical area, but an entire industrial empire built on human bones. Planet Gulag. This is what the prisoners themselves called the Kolyma region, and this definition perfectly reflected the scale of the tragedy that was taking place there. The history of Kolyma as a center of forced labor began in 1932, when geologists discovered rich gold deposits in the region. For the Soviet Union, which was internationally isolated and in dire need of foreign currency, this discovery was a real gift of fate. However, developing the deposits in conditions of permafrost and extreme climate required enormous human resources. Eduard Petrovich Berzin, appointed the first director of the Dalstroy Trust, received virtually unlimited powers from Moscow. He was tasked with creating an autonomous industrial powerhouse in Kolyma that could supply the Soviet Union with gold and other strategic resources. To this end, he was given tens of thousands of prisoners at his disposal, who were to become the labor force of the new Klondike. The first echelons of prisoners arrived in Magadan in the fall of 1932. The picture that unfolded before them was striking in its hopelessness. Endless tundra covered with permafrost, where even in summer the temperature rarely rose above 10 degrees Celsius. In winter, the frost reached 50 degrees below zero, turning human breath into a cloud of ice crystals. The organization of work at the mines was striking in its cruelty and, at the same time, its efficiency. Prisoners worked in 2 shifts of 12 hours each, without days off or holidays. Their main tools were a pickaxe, a shovel, and a wooden trough for washing gold-bearing rock. In the permafrost conditions, each cubic meter of soil had to be thawed with bonfires, which made the work incredibly laborious. The production quota for each prisoner was 2.5 cubic meters of rock per day. Failure to meet the quota was punished by cutting back on the already meager rations. The full ration consisted of 600 grams of bread, a portion of gruel made from rotten vegetables, and 100 grams of porridge. If the quota was not met, the ration was reduced to 400 grams of bread per day, which was not enough to survive in conditions of hard physical labor and extreme cold. The living conditions at the mines could be described as hellish even by Gulag standards. The barracks were semi-dugouts, partially dug into the permafrost. The roofs were covered with turf, which froze in winter and turned into an icy shell. Inside the barracks, up to 200 people were housed on bunks made of unplaned boards. The temperature inside rarely rose above zero, and the stoves were only heated for a few hours a day. The system of work incentives in Kolyma was particularly sophisticated. Prisoners were divided into categories depending on their performance of work quotas. Stakhanovites, who exceeded the norm by 150%, received additional rations and even small monetary rewards. Refusers, those who could not work due to their health, were doomed to certain death from starvation. Medical care in the Kolyma camps existed only nominally. There was one doctor for the entire mine, most often also a prisoner, who worked in exchange for leniency in the regime. There were practically no medicines, and hospital beds were reserved only for those who could still return to work. The rest were left to die in the barracks, and their bodies were carried out only in the spring, when the ground thawed for burials. But the most frightening thing was the psychological climate in the camps. The system encouraged informants and mutual hostility among prisoners. Pussies, prisoners who received light work in exchange for cooperation with the administration, became objects of hatred and contempt. The Thieves' Code punished any cooperation with bitches with death, which led to constant conflicts and bloodshed. Over the years of the Kolyma camp's existence, more than 3 million people passed through them. The exact number of deaths remains a state secret, but historians estimate it to be several 100,000 people. Every ton of gold mined in Kolyma was literally drenched in human blood. What else do the archives hide about planet Gulag? And what terrible discoveries await us in the depths of the Siberian taiga? In the polar tundra, beyond the Arctic Circle, where snow lies for 9 months of the year and the polar night lasts 2 months, a city arose that should not have existed. Vorkuta, the only city in the world built entirely by prisoners, became a symbol of how the Soviet regime could create industrial centers on human bones. The history of Vorkuta began in 1931, when geologist Georgy Alexandrovich Chernov discovered rich deposits of coal in the area. For the industrializing Soviet Union, this discovery was of strategic importance. Coal was needed for the metallurgical plants of the Urals and the European part of the country. However, no one wanted to voluntarily go to work in the Arctic cold. A solution was found quickly and cynically. The construction of coal mines and the city itself was entrusted to Gulag prisoners. The first batch of 2,000 builders arrived in the tundra in the fall of 1932. They were met by a lifeless plain covered with moss and lichen, where the only landmarks were rare geodetic marks. The conditions in which construction had to begin were truly inhuman. The temperature dropped to -50 degrees, and blizzards could last for weeks. The prisoners dug dugouts in the permafrost, using only pickaxes and shovels. Many of these first builders did not survive the first winter. Their bodies were found in the spring when the snow melted. Nikolai Arkhipov, appointed head of Vorkutlag, was tasked with building a modern industrial complex in the tundra. The plan was ambitious: to create a system of mines capable of producing millions of tons of coal per year, to build a city for the workers, and to connect it to the mainland by rail. All this had to be done by prisoners in the shortest possible time. The construction of the first mines turned into a living hell. The prisoners worked underground in permafrost conditions, where the temperature did not rise above -5 degrees even in summer. The air in the pits was so thin that it was only possible to work in short shifts. Collapses occurred daily, burying dozens of people. The system of labor organization in Vorkuta was particularly cruel. Prisoners worked in 3 8-hour shifts, but in fact spent 12 to 14 hours underground, including the time spent descending and ascending. The production quota was 3 tons of coal per person per shift, an amount that even experienced miners on the outside could hardly achieve. A distinctive feature of Vorkutlag was the use of prisoners not only as laborers, but also as engineering and technical personnel. Among the arrested were many qualified specialists: mining engineers, geologists, and builders. They were forced to develop designs for mines and industrial facilities under threat of execution for sabotage. The construction of the city of Vorkuta itself began in 1936. Prisoners built residential buildings, schools, hospitals, administrative buildings, the entire infrastructure of a modern city. The paradox was that the builders themselves were not allowed to live in the houses they built. The prisoners slept in barracks behind barbed wire, while the apartments they built were occupied by free workers and the camp administration. The Kotlas-Vorkuta Railway, stretching over 1,500 kilometers, became one of the bloodiest construction projects of the Gulag. It was laid through impassable swamps and tundra, in conditions where there was virtually no equipment. Prisoners carried rails and sleepers on their backs, dug embankments by hand, and built bridges from scrap materials. On average, 10 human lives were lost for every kilometer of this road. Medical care in Vorkutlag was organized according to the principle of fitness for work. The sick were treated only if they could be returned to work. Dystrophy, scurvy, and frostbite were considered malingering, and those who fell ill were sent to general labor, which was practically a death sentence. The camp's food system was based on the principle of cauldron rations. Prisoners received food in common pots, and the quality and quantity of food directly depended on the fulfillment of production norms. Stakhanovites received additional rations, while refuseniks had to make do with meager rations that were barely enough to sustain life. By the end of the 1930s, Vorkuta had become the largest coal center in the Soviet Union. The city grew by the hour, absorbing new waves of prisoners. According to official data, more than 500,000 people passed through Vorkutlag, but the real numbers may be significantly higher. The most cynical thing in the history of Vorkuta was that the city, built on the suffering of prisoners, was declared a model of socialist construction after the war. People preferred to forget the price at which it was created, but the tundra remembers everything, and to this day, the remains of those who paid with their lives for their labor exploits are still being found in the vicinity of the city. What other ghost towns are hidden in the Siberian taiga, and what happened in the secret camps that did not even make it into the official NKVD reports? In the north of the Krasnoyarsk territory, in conditions where humans cannot survive without constant heating, one of the most grandiose industrial empires of the 20th century arose. The Norilsk Mining and Metallurgical Combine became the crown jewel of Soviet industrialization and, at the same time, a symbol of how forced labor could create economic miracles. The history of Norilsk began in 1935 when a geological expedition led by Nikolai Urvantsev confirmed the existence of unique deposits of nickel, copper, cobalt, and platinum in the area. These metals were of strategic importance to the Soviet Union. Without them, the development of the aviation and military industries would have been impossible. Avram Pavlovich Zavenyagin, appointed director of the plant under construction, received a personal instruction from Stalin to turn the polar tundra into an industrial center of global significance. He was given virtually unlimited resources at his disposal. Tens of thousands of prisoners, modern equipment for the time, and complete freedom of action in achieving his goal. The first prisoners arrived in Norilsk in the summer of 1935 on barges along the Yenisei River. The journey lasted more than a month, and many could not endure the hardships of the river crossing. Those who reached their destination saw before them an endless tundra, where the only signs of human presence were surveying towers and temporary expedition warehouses. Construction of the plant began with the erection of temporary housing for prisoners. In conditions of permafrost, this was a virtually impossible task. The foundations had to be thawed with bonfires and then installed on wooden piles. The first barracks were frame structures, sheathed with boards and insulated with sawdust. The scale of the construction was mind-boggling. The plan was to build not just a mine, but an entire industrial complex with enrichment plants, metallurgical workshops, a power station, and a modern city for the service personnel. All this had to be created in conditions where the average annual temperature did not rise above -10 degrees Celsius. Ore mining in Norilsk was carried out both openly in quarries and underground in mines. Working in the quarries in winter was a real nightmare. At -40 degrees, metal tools literally stuck to your hands, and your breath turned into ice crystals that clogged your lungs. Underground work was no less dangerous. The mines had to be constantly heated to prevent the walls from freezing and collapsing. But there was a catastrophic shortage of fuel, and prisoners worked in conditions where the temperature in the pits dropped below zero. Frostbite occurred daily, and some miners lost fingers and toes to the cold. A distinctive feature of the Norilsk Combine was its use of the most advanced technologies of the time. Prisoner engineers designed unique furnaces for smelting ore, developed new methods of enrichment, and created technological lines that had no analogues in the world. The paradox was that the most advanced technologies were created by people deprived of basic human rights. The labor incentive system in Norilsk was perfected. Prisoners were divided into many categories depending on their qualifications, performance, and behavior. Highly skilled specialists could receive monetary rewards, additional food, and even separate rooms in the barracks. This created an illusion of fairness and motivated prisoners to cooperate with the administration. Medical care in Norilsk was better organized than in most other Gulag camps. This was due to the high value placed on skilled specialists. Their loss could jeopardize the fulfillment of production plans. The camp had a hospital with several hundred beds, specialized departments, and even operating rooms. Cultural life in Norilsk also differed from other camps. To maintain the morale of the specialist prisoners, the administration allowed concerts, theatrical performances, and even lectures on their specialties to be organized. Among the prisoners were many cultural figures, scientists, and engineers who continued their creative activities even in captivity. Construction of the city of Norilsk began in the late 1930s. Prisoner architects designed residential buildings adapted to Arctic conditions. A unique heating and ventilation system was developed to maintain comfortable conditions at extremely low temperatures. The city was built according to the principle of a social city, with a well-thought-out infrastructure and amenities. The transport problem was solved by creating a unique logistics system. In summer, cargo was delivered by barge along the Yenisei River, and in winter, by tractor and dog sled along winter roads. The Dudinka-Norilsk Railway was built, connecting the plant to the river port. Every kilometer of this road cost hundreds of human lives. By the beginning of the war, the Norilsk plant had become the world's largest producer of nickel and other non-ferrous metals. The plant's products were in such high demand that even during wartime, production not only did not decline, but actually increased. Norilsk nickel was used in the production of armor for tanks and aircraft, which made the plant a strategically important facility. But what price did humanity pay for this economic miracle? According to various estimates, more than 400,000 prisoners passed through Norilsk. The exact number of deaths remains a mystery, but researchers cite figures ranging from 70,000 to 100,000 people. Every ton of metal produced was literally paid for with human blood. What other secrets does the Arctic hide? And what happened in the classified facilities where the technologies of the future were created at the cost of human lives? May 17, 1933, went down in history as the day of the great victory of socialist construction. On this day, the first convoy of ships passed through the Belomor-Baltic Canal, connecting the White Sea with the Baltic Sea. Official propaganda proclaimed this a miracle of engineering. But behind the beautiful words lay one of the bloodiest construction projects in human history. The idea of connecting the northern seas by canal arose as early as the 19th century, but its implementation seemed impossible due to the complex terrain of Karelia and the enormous financial costs. The Soviet authorities solved this problem radically. The construction was entrusted to Gulag prisoners, whose lives had no economic value. Naftali Aronovich Frenkel, appointed chief engineer of the project, developed a unique system of re-education through labor. According to his theory, hard physical labor was supposed to turn enemies of the people into conscious builders of socialism. In practice, this meant working in inhuman conditions with minimal labor costs. Construction began in the fall of 1930. The first prisoners arrived in the Karelian forests when the frosts had already begun. They had to dig a 227-kilometer canal, build 19 locks, and completely change the hydrography of the entire region in 20 months. The working conditions were shockingly harsh, even by Gulag standards. The prisoners worked from dawn to dusk, with no days off or holidays. Their main tools were shovels, pickaxes, stretchers, and wheelbarrows. No mechanization was provided for. Human hands had to dig through millions of cubic meters of Karelian granite and rock. The work organization system was based on the military model. Prisoners were divided into brigades of 20 to 30 people, each of which was assigned a specific work area. The production quota was 2.5 cubic meters of rock per person per day, an amount that was practically impossible to achieve with primitive tools. The work of blasting rock was particularly difficult. Prisoners drilled holes by hand with hammers and chisels, then laid explosives and blew up rock formations. Safety precautions were not observed. Explosions were carried out without prior evacuation of workers, which led to numerous casualties. Living conditions at the construction site were catastrophic. Prisoners were housed in hastily built barracks without insulation or proper heating. In winter, the temperature inside the barracks dropped below zero, and people kept warm only with their own breath. Many froze to death in their sleep, not waiting for the morning check. The canal builders' meals were organized according to the principle of those who do not work do not eat. Only those who met 100% of the production quota received a full ration. It consisted of 600 grams of bread, a portion of gruel, and 100 grams of porridge. Failure to meet the quota was punished by a reduction in rations to 300 grams of bread per day. Medical care at the construction site was practically non-existent. There were only a few doctors for the entire canal, most of whom were also prisoners. There were no medicines, and treatment consisted of short-term release from work. Those suffering from malnutrition, scurvy, and other diseases continued to work until they were completely exhausted. The incentive system was based on the principle of carrot and stick. Exceeding the norms was rewarded with additional food, cash bonuses, and even early release. Strikers received red armbands and additional privileges. This created competition among prisoners and forced them to work to the limits of human endurance. Particular cynicism was evident in the organization of cultural and educational work. The construction site published a newspaper called Perikovka, which glorified the labor exploits of the prisoners. Concerts and lectures on re-education through labor were organized. The most active propagandists were rewarded and released early, which created the illusion of fairness in the system. The construction of the locks required high qualifications, so engineers and technicians were specially selected from among the prisoners. They worked under the constant threat of execution for sabotage and vandalism. Many engineering decisions were made under time pressure and without the necessary calculations, which later led to serious problems in the operation of the canal. Soil was transported on a narrow-gauge railway operated by the prisoners themselves. The wagons were pushed by hand along rails laid directly across swamps and forests. In winter, the work became a nightmare. The rails were covered with ice, and the wagons had to be dragged up slippery slopes. The women working on the canal did work that was no less difficult than that of the men. They carried stretchers with soil, worked in the logging industry, and operated primitive equipment. Pregnant women were exempt from work only in the last months of their pregnancy, and after giving birth, they returned to work within a few days. By the time construction was completed, the canal had become a veritable graveyard. The exact number of deaths remains a state secret, but researchers estimate the figure to be between 12,000 and 25,000 people. The bodies were buried right on the construction site, often in mass graves without identification marks. The most tragic irony was that the canal, built on the bones of tens of thousands of people, turned out to be practically useless for shipping. Its depth was insufficient for large ships, and the locks could not withstand intensive use. In fact, the canal was used only for river navigation and timber transport. But the propaganda machine presented the Belomor Canal as a triumph of socialist construction. A book entitled The Stalin-Belomor-Baltic Canal was published, glorifying the re-education of prisoners through labor. The real cost of this miracle was conveniently ignored. What other great construction projects hide their bloody secrets in the archives? And how many more nameless graves are hidden in the forests and swamps of Russia? Deep in the Siberian taiga, where kilometers of coniferous forests stretch to the horizon, lie the traces of one of the Gulag's most ambitious operations, the logging camps. These places, lost in endless forests, witnessed the tragedy of hundreds of thousands of prisoners whose labor turned the Soviet forestry industry into one of the world's leading industries. Logging in the USSR has always been of strategic importance. Wood was needed for construction, paper production, the chemical industry, and export. But the development of remote forest areas required enormous labor resources, which could only be obtained through forced labor. The system of logging camps began to be established in the late 1920s. The first camps appeared in the Arkhangelsk region, Komi, and Karelia, but soon expanded to Siberia, the Far East, and even Kazakhstan. By the mid-1930s, more than 500,000 prisoners were involved in logging. A distinctive feature of the logging camps was their mobility. Unlike industrial complexes tied to specific deposits, logging sites were constantly moving as the forests were cut down. This created additional difficulties for the prisoners, who had to constantly build new barracks and set up temporary campsites. Viktor Grigorievich Nasedkin, one of the organizers of the Gulag logging system, developed a unique scheme for exploiting forest resources. According to his plans, prisoners were not only supposed to cut down trees, but also build roads and sawmills and harvest and float timber down rivers. In fact, a complete cycle of timber production was created on the basis of forced labor. Working conditions in the logging camps were particularly difficult due to their remoteness from civilization. Prisoners worked in the taiga for 12 to 14 hours a day, using only hand tools. axes, two-handed saws, and winches. Mechanization was minimal, and the main burden fell on human strength. The production quota for lumberjacks was 3 to 5 cubic meters of wood per day, depending on the type of tree and working conditions. This quota was practically impossible to meet for the emaciated prisoners working with primitive tools. Failure to meet the quota was punished by a reduction in their already meager rations. Living conditions in the logging camps were primitive even by GULAG standards. The barracks were built from whatever materials were available: untreated logs, planks, and sometimes just branches and moss. Heating was provided by potbelly stoves, but there was often not enough firewood, as the harvested timber was intended for state needs. Working in winter conditions was particularly dangerous. At temperatures of -30 to 40 degrees, metal tools became as brittle as glass, and it was practically impossible to work with gloves on. Many prisoners suffered severe frostbite and lost fingers and toes. The mortality rate from hypothermia reached catastrophic levels. The harvested wood was transported mainly by prisoners. In winter, the logs were transported on sleds pulled by people or horses. In summer, rafts were used on rivers, which also required the constant participation of prisoners to steer the rafts and prevent jams. The food system in the logging camps was organized on the principle of work rations. The diet consisted mainly of bread, porridge, and vegetable soup of dubious quality. Meat was given out extremely rarely, and vitamins were practically absent. This led to mass outbreaks of scurvy, dystrophy, and other diseases associated with malnutrition. Medical care in remote logging areas was virtually unavailable. Medical stations were located in the central camp estates, which took several days to reach on foot along forest trails. Many sick and injured prisoners died without receiving medical attention. A special category of logging camps were the so-called commissions, small areas where 50 to 100 prisoners worked under minimal guard. It was believed that escape from the depths of the taiga was impossible, so the regime was more lenient. However, this did not make the working conditions any less harsh. Women in logging camps not only performed auxiliary work, but also felled trees on a par with men. They worked in sawmills, sorted wood, and prepared food for the work brigades. Motherhood did not exempt them from hard labor. Pregnant women worked until the last days of their pregnancy and returned to work a few weeks after giving birth. The construction of logging roads was one of the most difficult jobs in the logging camps. Prisoners laid narrow-gauge railways and dirt roads through swamps, ravines, and dense forests. Work was carried out all year round, in all weather conditions. Bridges were built from improvised materials, often without observing basic safety standards. Rafting timber down rivers was a real ordeal for the prisoners. They had to steer huge rafts in flood conditions and ice drifts. Many drowned in the cold waters of the northern rivers, unable to swim. Rafting work was considered one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire GULAG system. Labor productivity in the logging camps was extremely low due to the exhaustion and demoralization of the prisoners. To increase efficiency, the camp administration used a system of social competition in which teams competed with each other to fulfill their quotas. The winners received additional rations and small privileges. By the end of the 1930s, the logging camps had become a real industry. The Soviet Union became one of the world's leading exporters of timber. But few people knew the price that had been paid for this economic success. Millions of cubic meters of timber were harvested at the cost of hundreds of thousands of human lives. After the war, many logging camps were disbanded and their sites abandoned. The taiga quickly swallowed up the traces of human activity. The barracks were destroyed, the roads overgrown, and only the remains of barbed wire and grave mounds reminded of the existence of the camps. Today, traces of logging camps can still be found deep in the Siberian taiga. Archaeologists discover the remains of barracks, tools, and prisoners' personal belongings. These finds are silent witnesses to one of the most tragic pages in the history of the exploitation of Russia's forest resources. How many more secrets do the dense forests hold? And what terrible discoveries await researchers in the most remote corners of the taiga? In official NKVD reports, female prisoners were referred to as Special Contingent Category Z. But behind this bureaucratic wording lay one of the most tragic pages of the GULAG. Women's camps in the Siberian taiga became a place where human dignity was subjected to particularly sophisticated trials. By the mid-1930s, more than 150,000 women were being held in the GULAG system. Among them were political prisoners, wives of enemies of the people, peasant women convicted of stealing grain, and criminals. All of them found themselves in the equally inhumane conditions of the Siberian camps. Maria Danishevskaya, the ex-wife of a repressed party official, later recalled, "The women's barracks differed from the men's only in that they smelled even worse, from children's diapers, dirty laundry, and women's diseases. One barracks housed up to 300 women of all ages, from 16-year-old girls to 70-year-old women. The accommodation system in women's camps did not provide for any privacy. The bunks were arranged in 3 tiers, with 2 or 3 people sleeping on each. There was no bedding. The prisoners slept on bare boards, covering themselves with their own clothes. In winter, the barracks were so cold that the women kept warm by huddling together. The situation was especially difficult for pregnant women and mothers with children. Pregnant women were exempt from work only in the last days before giving birth. Births took place in the camp hospital, if there was one, or directly in the barracks on straw. Infant mortality reached 70% due to the lack of medical care and proper nutrition. Children under the age of 4 were allowed to stay with their mothers in the camp. But the conditions were catastrophic. Infant mortality exceeded all conceivable limits. Many mothers themselves asked for their children to be taken to orphanages, realizing that they had no chance of survival in the camp. The use of women's labor in the camps did not take into account their physiological characteristics. Women cut down trees, carried heavy loads, and worked on construction sites under the same conditions as men. Their production quotas were set only 10 to 15% lower than those of men, which, given their lesser physical strength, made them practically impossible to meet. A particularly common type of work for women was peat extraction. In the swamps of the Arkhangelsk and Komi regions, women dug peat with shovels while waist-deep in icy water. The work was carried out from early morning until late evening, without breaks or days off. Many fell ill with pneumonia and died within a few weeks. Sewing production in women's camps turned into real hard labor. Women worked 16 to 18 hours a day, fulfilling military orders. The lighting was so poor that many lost their eyesight. Production quotas were constantly increasing, and failure to meet them was punished by deprivation of food rations. The system of punishment in women's camps was particularly cruel. For the slightest infraction, women were placed in solitary confinement, a cold, windowless cell where they had to stand or sit on the bare floor. Pregnant and nursing mothers were not exempt from this punishment. Medical care in women's camps was extremely poor. There were no gynecologists at all. and women's diseases were treated by male paramedics, or not treated at all. Childbirth took place in unsanitary conditions, which led to high maternal mortality. The psychological state of women in the camps was particularly difficult. Separation from their children, uncertainty about their fate, humiliation, and violence broke even the strongest. Many went mad. Others committed suicide. Suicide attempts were so frequent that everything that could be used to hang oneself was removed from the women's barracks. A special category were the wives of enemies of the people, women arrested solely for being married to repressed individuals. Among them were many educated people, teachers, doctors, engineers. They were forced to do the dirtiest and hardest work, constantly reminded of their criminal past. Children in women's camps witnessed horrors that scarred their psyche for life. They saw death, violence, and cruelty at an age when they should have been playing and learning. Many of the surviving children remained psychologically traumatized for the rest of their lives. The criminal world in women's camps had its own peculiarities. The Blatnyaki kept the political prisoners in fear, taking their clothes and food. The camp administration encouraged this situation, using the criminals to maintain order and suppress discontent. Release from the women's camps often did not mean a return to normal life. Many women were so emaciated and ill that they died shortly after their release. Others could not find work or housing because of their criminal records. Families often refused to take them back. What other horrors were hidden behind the walls of the women's barracks? And how many mothers never saw their children again after their release? On April 7, 1935, the Central Executive Committee and the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR issued a decree on measures to combat crime among minors. This document lowered the age of criminal responsibility to 12 and allowed the death penalty to be applied to children. Thus began one of the most monstrous experiments in human history: the creation of children's correctional labor colonies. By the end of the 1930s, there were more than 50,000 juvenile prisoners in the Gulag system. These were the children of enemies of the people, street children, and teenagers convicted of theft and hooliganism. They all faced the same fate: re-education through labor in conditions where only the strongest could survive. The first children's colony was established on the Solovetsky Islands in 1927. Initially, it was intended for street children, but soon young political prisoners began to be sent there as well. The conditions for the children were no different from those in the adult camps. The same barracks, the same meager food, the same exhausting labor. Anatoly Zhigulin, who was sent to a children's colony at the age of 16, later wrote, "These camps were called children's camps only because they held children. In all other respects, they were ordinary death camps, where a child became a number and his life was worthless." The system of managing children's colonies was based on the same principle as adult camps. At the head was a chief from the NKVD, under whom worked educators, guards, and medical personnel. However, educational work boiled down to physical coercion and intimidation. The use of children's labor in the colonies was striking in its cruelty. Teenagers worked in logging, quarries, and road construction. The working day lasted 10 to 12 hours without weekends or holidays. The production quotas were set at the same level as for adults, which made them virtually impossible to meet. Work in brick factories, where children made building materials for the camp's needs, was particularly hard. Teenagers worked at furnaces at temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius, carried heavy molds, and kneaded clay. Many suffered severe burns and injuries from primitive equipment. The food system in children's colonies was organized according to the labor principle. Only those children who met adult production quotas received a full ration. The rest had to make do with a reduced ration, which was barely enough to sustain life. This led to mass exhaustion and high child mortality. Housing conditions in children's colonies were catastrophic. Up to 300 children of different ages were housed in one barracks. Young children slept alongside teenage criminals, which led to constant violence and bullying. The administration did not intervene in these conflicts, considering them part of the re-education process. Medical care in children's colonies was practically non-existent. Sick children were not treated, but simply isolated in separate rooms, where they either recovered on their own or died. Epidemics of typhus, dysentery, and other diseases wiped out entire barracks. Education in children's colonies existed only nominally. Schools were only found in large colonies, and even there, classes were held irregularly. Most children worked from morning to night, with no time for study. Many left the colonies practically illiterate. The system of punishment in children's colonies was particularly sophisticated. For the slightest infractions, children were placed in solitary confinement, deprived of food, and forced to stand in the cold. Physical punishment was also used, although it was officially prohibited. Many children could not withstand such trials and suffered mental breakdowns. A special category were the children of enemies of the people, the sons and daughters of repressed parents. They were treated with particular cruelty, constantly reminded of their criminal origins. These children were forced to renounce their parents and write denunciations of other prisoners. The thieves' code in children's colonies was particularly cruel. Juvenile criminals created their own hierarchy, where the strong ruthlessly exploited the weak. The sixes had to serve the authorities, carry out any orders, and give up their food and clothing. Refusal was punished by beatings and even murder. Attempts to escape from juvenile colonies were frequent, but rarely successful. The children did not know the area and had no food or warm clothes. Most fugitives were caught within a few days, after which they faced severe punishment. Some were shot as an example to others. The psychological trauma suffered in the children's colonies lasted a lifetime. Many former juvenile prisoners were never able to adapt to normal life. They did not know how to build families, trust people, or find their place in society. The GULAG system crippled not only bodies, but also souls. Release from children's colonies often did not mean a return home. Many children did not know if their parents were alive or where to find them. The state provided no assistance in social adaptation. A significant proportion of former juvenile prisoners ended up back in prison. Documents on children's colonies are still classified in many archives. Official statistics are silent about the real scale of the tragedy, but individual testimonies suggest that at least 100,000 minors passed through the Gulag's children's colonies. What other terrible secrets do the archives hold about the fate of children in the Gulag? And how many young lives were lost in the name of re-education through labor? Etap was a word that struck terror into the hearts of all Gulag prisoners. Behind it lay a complex system for transporting millions of people across the country in conditions where survival was a miracle. The transit routes stretched from the western borders of the USSR to Chukotka, creating a gigantic network of human suffering. The convoy system in the Gulag was developed with German pedantry and Russian ruthlessness. Each prisoner received a transport sheet indicating the route, delivery times, and special conditions of detention. But behind the bureaucratic precision lay a veritable conveyor belt of death. Matvey Davidovich Berman, one of the organizers of the transport system, created detailed instructions for the transportation of prisoners. According to these documents, each person in the car was supposed to have 1.5 square meters of space. In practice, 80 to 100 people were placed in freight cars, which made normal existence impossible. Railway stages were the most common way of transporting prisoners. Trains consisting of 50 to 60 freight cars traveled across the country for weeks. Each car had a small stove that was lit for a few hours a day, a toilet in the corner, and barred windows under the ceiling. The conditions in the transport cars were inhumane. Prisoners traveled standing or sitting, pressed close together. Only the sick and dying had enough space to lie down. The air was so stale that many lost consciousness from lack of oxygen. Food during transit was kept to a minimum. Once a day, prisoners received a piece of bread and a mug of gruel. Water was given irregularly, often only every few days. In the summer heat, the temperature in the closed cars rose to 50 degrees, leading to mass dehydration. The winter stages were particularly difficult. In temperatures below 30 degrees below zero, the cars turned into ice-cold crypts. The stoves could not cope with the heating, and the prisoners warmed themselves only with their breath and the warmth of their neighbors. Many suffered frostbite on their limbs, and the weakest froze to death. Medical care during the stages was practically non-existent. In the best-case scenario, there was one isolation car for the sick, but more often than not, the dying were simply left among the healthy. Corpses were only removed at large stations, and sometimes they were taken to the final destination. The transport security system was based on the principle of maximum cruelty. Escorts received bonuses for delivering prisoners without any escapes, so any attempt to break the rules was suppressed with weapons. Shooting to kill was permitted for the slightest disobedience. Transit prisons were intermediate points in the transport system. Here, prisoners waited to be sent on, sometimes for months. Conditions in transit prisons were even worse than in the train cars. The cells were several times overcrowded. There were no sanitary conditions, and epidemics wiped out hundreds of people. Prisoner transports on foot were used in remote areas where there were no railways. Prisoners were escorted hundreds of kilometers across rough terrain, in all weather conditions. The pace of the march was so fast that those who fell behind were shot on the spot. These journeys turned into veritable death marches. Sea stages in the Far East were particularly dangerous. Prisoners were transported on old steamboats in holds that were not suitable for humans. Rocking, stuffiness, and lack of ventilation led to mass illness and death. Many ships turned into floating morgues. River stages along Siberian rivers were carried out on barges converted into prisons. The conditions were no better than those at sea. The same cramped quarters, the same unsanitary conditions. The journey from Arkhangelsk to Kolyma could take 2 to 3 months, and not everyone survived to the end of the journey. Secret stages with particularly important prisoners constituted a special category. They were transported in separate carriages under heavy guard, but the conditions of detention were no better than usual. The guards received special instructions not to allow any escapes at any cost. Women's stages had their own peculiarities. Pregnant women and mothers with infants were transported under the same conditions as the rest. The prisoners themselves delivered babies on the way. There was no medical assistance. Infant mortality on women's stages reached catastrophic levels. The document flow of the stage system was striking in its detail. Detailed lists were compiled for each prisoner, indicating the charges, the term of imprisonment, and the destination. These documents made it possible to track the movements of people throughout the country. The thieves' code was particularly strong on the stages. The blatni, thieves, took the best places in the carriages, took food from the frayers, newcomers, and established their own rules. The guards often used criminals to maintain discipline among political prisoners. Attempts to escape from the stages were rare due to the complexity of organizing them. The carriages were locked from the outside, the windows were barred, and the guards constantly monitored the situation. Those who did decide to escape were usually caught within a few hours. Statistics on the transport system are still classified, but individual documents allow us to estimate its scale. In the 1930s alone, several million people were transported along these routes. The mortality rate during transport ranged from 5 to 15%, depending on the season and the distance traveled. What other horrors does the history of the transit routes conceal? And how many people disappeared without a trace in freight cars going nowhere? Contrary to the popular belief about the submissiveness of Soviet prisoners, the history of the Gulag is full of examples of desperate resistance. Uprisings and mass escapes occurred regularly, although the authorities carefully concealed these facts from the public. Behind the barbed wire of the Siberian camps, a real war was unfolding between the guards and the prisoners. The first major uprising in the history of the Gulag took place on the Solovetsky Islands in 1923. Prisoners seized several monastery buildings and held out for 3 days. The uprising was suppressed with the use of artillery, and more than 200 people were killed. This incident set a precedent for all subsequent protests. The camp security system was constantly improved, taking into account the experience of uprisings and escapes. A multi-level system of obstacles was created around each camp. Barbed wire, minefields, watchtowers with machine guns. But the prisoners did not remain passive, inventing new ways to overcome obstacles. Yevgeny Fyodorovich Kropotkin, nephew of the famous anarchist, organized an uprising in one of the Kolyma camps in 1934. The rebels seized a weapons depot and held out for a week. The suppression of the uprising turned into a full-scale military operation involving aircraft and artillery. Escapes from the Gulag camps were technically extremely difficult operations. Prisoners had to overcome not only the camp guards, but also thousands of kilometers of taiga, where it was practically impossible to survive without special training. Most of the escapees died from cold, hunger, or in encounters with wild animals. The most famous escapee in the history of the Gulag was Sławek Rawicz, a Polish officer who, together with a group of comrades, escaped from a camp in Yakutia. Their journey through Siberia, Mongolia, and Tibet to India lasted more than a year and became legendary. Most of the participants in the trek died, but a few people still made it to freedom. The criminal world had its own specific approach to organizing escapes. The blatni created complex support networks outside the camps, bribed guards, and used their connections with the outside world. Their escapes were more organized and had a better chance of success than the attempts of political prisoners. Winter escapes were practically suicidal, but they were still attempted. Prisoners hoped that the severe frosts would hinder the pursuit. However, the harsh climate of Siberia gave the fugitives virtually no chance. Most froze to death in the first few days. Female escapes had their own characteristics. Female prisoners often used their connections with free workers, who helped them organize their escapes. some married local residents, which allowed them to legally remain in the camp area after their release. Group escapes required serious preparation and secrecy. Prisoners spent months making plans, stockpiling food, and making warm clothes. But more often than not, one of the participants would inform on the others to the administration in the hope of leniency or extra rations. The system for pursuing escapees was worked out in detail. Immediately after an escape was discovered, all services were mobilized: the convoy, the police, border guards, and military units. Sniffer dogs, aircraft, and the local population were used. Cash rewards were offered for the capture of escapees. The punishments for escape attempts were severe. Captured fugitives were placed in punishment cells, had their sentences increased, and were sometimes shot as an example to others. The organizers of group escapes and repeat attempts were punished particularly harshly. The uprising in Norilsk in 1953 was one of the largest in the history of the Gulag. The rebels controlled the camp for almost 2 months, set up their own administration, and established order. Suppressing the uprising required the introduction of troops and led to hundreds of casualties. The Kengir uprising of 1954 lasted 40 days. The prisoners took control of the entire camp, set up their own government, and even organized cultural life. The uprising was suppressed by tanks, which became a symbol of the regime's cruelty. Escapes during transport were more frequent, as security was less tight. Prisoners jumped off moving trains, attacked guards, and used any opportunity to escape. But even here, the chances of success were minimal. Some escapes turned into real adventures. Prisoners dressed up in guards' uniforms, forged documents, and created cover stories. These operations required extraordinary skills and luck, so they were extremely rare. Political prisoners often organized hunger strikes as a form of protest. These actions were not escapes in the literal sense, but they posed a serious threat to the administration. The hunger strikers were force-fed and placed in solitary confinement, but the protests continued. The camp administration used provocateurs to uncover escape plans. Informers infiltrated groups of conspirators, provoked them into revealing their plans, and then turned in their comrades. This system of mutual distrust made it much more difficult to organize escapes. Documents about uprisings and escapes in the Gulag are still classified in many archives. The authorities did not want to acknowledge the scale of resistance in the camps. However, individual testimonies suggest that escape attempts were made daily in all camps of the system. What other secrets do the documents about resistance in the Gulag hold? And how many heroic stories remain unknown? The death of Joseph Stalin on March 5, 1953, was a turning point in the history of the Gulag. The new leadership of the country, headed by Nikita Khrushchev, understood that the system of mass coercion was economically inefficient and politically dangerous. The gradual liquidation of the camps began, but this process was accompanied by a careful concealment of the traces of crimes. Already in March 1953, Lavrenti Beria signed an amnesty decree that affected more than 1 million prisoners. However, the mass release led to chaos. The former prisoners did not know where to go. They had no documents, no jobs, and no housing. Many died of exhaustion after their release. The process of closing the camps took several years. The administration hastily destroyed compromising documents, filled in mass graves, and dismantled camp facilities. Traces of the bloodiest camps, where mortality exceeded all reasonable limits, were carefully concealed. Former camp commanders received new appointments in other regions or retired with generous pensions. None of them were punished for crimes against humanity. Moreover, many continued to work in the correctional system, using the experience they had gained in the Gulag. The territories of the former camps were transferred to various departments or simply abandoned. Ordinary enterprises, hospitals, and schools were built on the sites of some camps. The new residents of these places were often unaware of the tragic history of their villages and towns. Secret instructions prescribed the complete destruction of all material traces of the camps. The barracks were burned or dismantled for firewood, the barbed wire was sold for scrap metal, and the watchtowers were dismantled. Traces of mass graves were destroyed with particular care. Some of the Gulag's documents have been preserved in the central archives, but most of them were destroyed on site. Prisoners' personal files, medical records, and lists of the dead were all burned in the camp kitchens or buried in the ground. Former prisoners received certificates of release, but these did not indicate the reasons for their arrest or the conditions of their detention. Many received wolf passports, with restrictions on their choice of residence. It was dangerous to talk about what they had experienced in the camps. They could be arrested again. Relatives of those who died in the camps received no information about the fate of their loved ones. Officially, they were considered to have died from illness or accident. Burial sites were not disclosed, and memorial services were not allowed. Some camps were not closed, but were transformed into ordinary penal colonies. Formally, these were new institutions, but in fact, the same rules continued to apply, and even the same people continued to work there. Only the names and some formalities changed. The economic assets of the Gulag were transferred to civilian departments. The mines, factories, and roads built by prisoners continued to function, bringing profit to the state. No one calculated the real cost of these facilities, taking into account the human sacrifices. The international community received virtually no information about the closure of the Gulag. Soviet propaganda presented it as a humanization of the prison system, without mentioning the scale of previous crimes. Western countries, interested in easing tensions, did not insist on a full investigation. Witnesses to the crimes of the Gulag found themselves in a difficult position. Former guards and camp administrators continued to live their normal lives, receiving pensions and awards. Former prisoners were forced to remain silent about their experiences, fearing new repressions. Some material traces of the camps have been preserved by chance. In remote areas of the taiga, the remains of barracks, prisoners' belongings, and elements of camp infrastructure are still being found. These finds are silent witnesses to a tragedy that the authorities tried to erase from memory. The archives of the KGB and its successors still contain classified materials about the Gulag. Access to these documents is restricted, and many files have been destroyed after the expiration of the storage period. The full picture of the crimes of the system may never be restored. Attempts to create memorials to the victims of the Gulag have been met with resistance from the authorities. The few monuments that have been erected have often been vandalized. Society was not ready for an honest conversation about the past. Some of the former camp territories were declared protected areas or nature reserves. Formally, this was done to protect nature, but in fact, it restricted access by researchers and journalists to mass burial sites. Some cities that grew up on the sites of camps still hide their origins. Their official history glosses over the role of forced labor in their construction. Museums talk about the labor heroism of the builders, without mentioning the prisoners. The process of rehabilitating victims of political repression began only in the late 1980s. But even then, it only concerned political prisoners. The fates of criminals, prisoners of war, and deported peoples remained in the shadows. The complete closure of the Gulag as a system did not occur until 1960. But by that time, many traces of crimes had been destroyed, witnesses had died or remained silent, and archives had been purged of compromising materials. What other secrets do the special archives hide? And will it ever be possible to fully restore the truth about the scale of the Gulag tragedy? Deep in the Siberian taiga, where nature is slowly absorbing the traces of human activity, modern researchers are working to reconstruct the forgotten history of the Gulag. Camp archaeology has become a new scientific discipline, allowing the daily life and living conditions of prisoners to be reconstructed from material remains. The first scientific expeditions to the sites of former camps began only in the 1990s. Until then, access to remote areas was restricted, and the subject of the Gulag remained taboo. Russian and foreign historians became pioneers in this field, risking their own safety for the sake of restoring historical truth. Igor Petrovich Kuznetsov, a leading specialist in Gulag archaeology, has surveyed more than 150 former campsites over the course of his 20-year career. His expeditions use the most modern methods, including ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, and unmanned aerial vehicles. Each find is documented and entered into a special database. The search for traces of the camps is complicated by the fact that many of them were deliberately destroyed when they were closed. Researchers rely on indirect evidence, changes in vegetation, remains of foundations, fragments of barbed wire. Sometimes the only indication of a camp's existence is the memories of local residents. Modern technology allows underground structures to be detected without excavation. Ground-penetrating radar shows the contours of buried foundations, remains of communications, and mass burial sites. These methods are especially important when working in areas where prisoners' graves have been preserved. Archaeological finds tell amazing stories about life in the camps. Homemade knives carved from scrap metal speak of a constant struggle for survival. Fragments of homemade pottery show how prisoners tried to create at least a minimum of comfort in inhuman conditions. Particularly valuable are the finds of prisoners' personal belongings. Homemade playing cards, chess pieces carved from wood, and primitive musical instruments testify to the fact that even in the hell of the Gulag, people retain their need for culture and entertainment. The study of burial sites requires particular sensitivity and adherence to ethical standards. Archaeologists work in close cooperation with representatives of various religious denominations and national associations. The remains found are examined by anthropologists, who can determine age, sex, and cause of death. Anthropological studies of the prisoners' remains paint a grim picture of life in the camps. Many show signs of hard physical labor, chronic malnutrition, and various diseases. Some skeletons bear traces of violent death, skull fractures, gunshot wounds. Expeditions to remote areas require serious preparation and significant financial costs. Some sites can only be reached by helicopter or snowmobile. Fieldwork is carried out in harsh natural conditions, in the taiga, tundra, and mountains, often in extreme weather. International cooperation plays an important role in studying the legacy of the Gulag. Foreign scientists bring modern equipment, share methodologies, and help finance expeditions. Joint research projects are being created with the participation of Russian, American, and European specialists. Local residents often become valuable assistants to researchers. They know where to find remnants of barbed wire in the forest, remember their parents' stories about political prisoners, and show places that are considered bad. This oral history complements the archaeological data. The findings are documented according to the strictest scientific standards. Each item is photographed, measured, and described. Detailed excavation plans are drawn up and field diaries are kept. All information is entered into computer databases for subsequent analysis. The restoration of the found objects requires special skills. Metal items are heavily corroded, wooden items are rotten, and woven materials are practically impossible to preserve in the Siberian climate. Restorers use the most modern conservation methods. The creation of museums on the sites of former camps has met with mixed reactions. Local authorities often resist, fearing a negative impact on the region's tourist appeal. But enthusiasts continue their work, understanding the importance of preserving historical memory. Virtual reconstructions of the camps, created on the basis of archaeological data, allow us to imagine what these places looked like when they were in operation. Three-dimensional models of barracks, watchtowers, and administrative buildings help to understand the organization of the camp space. Genetic research on remains opens up new possibilities for identifying victims. DNA analysis makes it possible to establish the ethnicity and sometimes even the specific identity of the deceased. This gives relatives a chance to learn the fate of their ancestors. Climate change creates both new opportunities and threats for Gulag archaeology. The melting of permafrost exposes previously inaccessible objects, but at the same time destroys organic remains. Researchers are racing against time. Digital archives are being created to preserve all the information collected. Photographs, video recordings, three-dimensional models, and databases of findings are all posted on the internet and made available to researchers around the world. A global memory of the tragedy of the Gulag is being created. Educational programs based on archaeological findings help convey the truth about Soviet repression to young people. School children and students participate in expeditions, study the objects found, and listen to the stories of surviving witnesses. Ethical issues remain among the most difficult in Gulag archaeology. How can mass burial sites be investigated without disturbing the dead? How can we talk about the horrors we find without traumatizing the living? There are no easy answers to these dilemmas. International organizations support projects to study the legacy of the Gulag. UNESCO has included several sites on its World Heritage List, which ensures their protection and funding for research. This is recognition of the importance of the issue at the global level. What other terrible discoveries await researchers in the depths of the taiga? And will it be possible to reconstruct the full picture of the tragedy before time erases the last traces? The classified archives of Russian archives contain documents that could overturn perceptions of the scale of the Gulag. We are talking about dozens and possibly hundreds of camps that never appeared on official maps and whose existence was known only to a small circle of insiders. The system of secret camps began to be created in the mid-1930s, when the NKVD began to implement particularly important projects of national significance. These facilities were not part of the general structure of the Gulag and were financed by separate classified budget items. Anatoly Sudoplatov, son of the famous intelligence officer, gained access to his father's archives and discovered references to special facilities that were serviced by prisoners of special categories. Among them were scientists, engineers, and military specialists who worked on secret projects in conditions similar to those in the camps. Sharashkas, design bureaus for prisoners, were just the tip of the iceberg. There were secret camps where strategic materials were mined, new types of weapons were tested, and medical experiments were conducted. Information about these facilities was classified as top secret and of special importance. The archives of the Main Directorate for Atomic Energy contain fragmentary information about camps associated with the uranium project. Prisoners mined uranium ore in mines without observing radiation safety measures. Many died of radiation sickness, unaware of the true causes of their suffering. A special category was made up of experimental camps, where new methods of re-educating prisoners were tested. These institutions used psychotropic drugs, psychological influence methods, and experimental detention regimes. The results of the research were used to improve the entire camp system. Secret camps for foreigners were located in specially guarded areas. They held high-ranking prisoners of war, captured spies, and political emigrants. Their existence was categorically denied at the international level, and traces of their stay were carefully destroyed. In the Chita region, there was a camp where prisoners participated in chemical weapons testing. The experiments were conducted on volunteers from among those sentenced to death, who were promised a pardon. Most of the test subjects died in terrible agony. The archives of the Ministry of Defense contain references to special battalions that were not formally part of the Gulag structure, but were in fact militarized camps. Prisoners who were military personnel built secret facilities, serviced chemical weapons depots, and participated in dangerous experiments. Medical experiments in secret camps reached monstrous proportions. Prisoners became guinea pigs in the testing of new drugs, the study of the effects of radiation, and research into the limits of human endurance. The results of these studies were passed on to scientific institutes. A double accounting system made it possible to conceal the existence of secret camps. Officially, prisoners were registered in ordinary camps, but in fact, they were held in classified facilities. This created confusion in the documents and made it difficult to find traces of the repressed. The Gulag's geological exploration teams worked in the most remote areas of the country, studying deposits of strategic materials. These expeditions often turned into mobile camps, where prisoners worked for months in complete isolation from the outside world. The construction of underground factories and bunkers was carried out by special camp units. Prisoners dug tunnels, built fortifications, and created underground cities. After the work was completed, many of those involved in the construction were shot to preserve state secrets. KGB archives contain information about filtration camps, where repatriated Soviet citizens were subjected to special treatment. These institutions were not formally part of the Gulag system, but the conditions of detention in them differed little from those in the camps. Secret documents testify to the existence of experimental settlements, where methods of mass control over the population were studied. The inhabitants of these settlements were unaware of their status as test subjects, but were subjected to various forms of psychological and social influence. In Siberia, there were camps for prisoners of special categories, former party officials, military leaders, and representatives of the creative intelligentsia. The conditions in these institutions were milder, but isolation from the outside world was absolute. The USSR's space program also used prisoner labor. Secret camps were used for the construction of spaceports, the production of rocket fuel, and test sites. Many technical solutions were developed in Sharashkas, under the guidance of convicted designers. Biological experiments in secret camps included testing bacteriological weapons, studying the effects of extreme conditions on the human body, and selection experiments. These studies were conducted under special secrecy and were personally supervised by Beria. Documents on the liquidation of secret camps were destroyed with particular care. The participants in the experiments were transferred to ordinary camps or shot. Material traces were destroyed, and witnesses were made to sign non-disclosure agreements under threat of the death penalty. Modern researchers are piecing together a map of the secret camps using indirect data, relatives' memories, and random documents. But the full picture may never be reconstructed due to the thoroughness with which the traces were destroyed. What other monstrous secrets are hidden in the special archives of Russia? And how many horrific experiments on humans were carried out under the guise of state secrecy? More than half a century has passed since the official closure of the Gulag, but its legacy continues to influence Russian society and the state. The system of mass coercion left deep scars on the national consciousness, shaped a particular mentality, and created traditions that are still evident today. The modern Russian prison system largely follows the traditions of the Gulag. The principles of organizing prisons and colonies, methods of treating prisoners, and the system of punishment all have their roots in the Soviet camp system. Many correctional facilities are located in the same places where the Gulag camps once stood. In his later works, Alexander Solzhenitsyn repeatedly emphasized that the Gulag had not disappeared, but had merely been transformed. The names had changed, some methods had been softened, but the essence of the system of coercion remained the same. In his opinion, Russian society had not yet overcome its totalitarian syndrome. The geographical map of Russia still bears traces of the Gulag. Many cities and towns in Siberia, the north, and the Far East grew out of camp settlements. Their layout, architecture, and social structure retain the imprint of their camp past. Residents often do not know the true history of their settlements. The economic consequences of the Gulag are still felt today. Many industrial facilities built by prisoners continue to operate and generate profits. Railways, mines, factories, canals, all of these are legacies of forced labor. But when calculating their value, no one takes into account the human sacrifices. The psychological trauma inflicted by the Gulag is passed down from generation to generation. The children and grandchildren of those who were repressed often suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder without realizing its causes. Fear of authority, distrust of the state, and a tendency toward conformism are all consequences of mass terror. The cultural memory of the Gulag in Russia remains fragmented and contradictory. On the one hand, memorial centers have been created, books have been published, and films have been made. On the other hand, the topic of repression remains uncomfortable for the authorities and society. Many prefer to forget the past rather than come to terms with it. Russian historiography of the Gulag is developing controversially. Liberal historians are trying to study the topic objectively, but they face restrictions on access to archives. Official historiography prefers to talk about excesses and mistakes, avoiding recognition of the systematic nature of the repressions. The Russian education system does not cover the topic of the Gulag sufficiently. School textbooks devote a few paragraphs to this issue, and many universities do not offer courses on the history of repression at all. Young people often have a vague idea of the scale of the tragedy. International perceptions of Russian history are largely determined by attitudes toward the legacy of the Gulag. The Russian authorities' unwillingness to fully condemn the repressions of the past is seen as a sign of continuing totalitarian tendencies. This affects the country's image on the world stage. Human rights organizations in Russia continue to fight to preserve the memory of the victims of the Gulag. Memorial and other organizations are engaged in educational work, creating databases of repressed individuals and organizing commemorative events. But their activities are often met with opposition from the authorities. The literary legacy of the Gulag remains one of the most important sources of information about the camp system. The works of Solzhenitsyn, Shalamov, and Ginsburg are read all over the world and shape perceptions of Soviet repression. But in Russia itself, these books are not included in the compulsory school curriculum. The Russian judicial system has not conducted a full investigation into the crimes of the Gulag. None of the organizers and perpetrators of mass repression have been brought to justice. This creates a sense of impunity and may contribute to the repetition of similar crimes in the future. Religious denominations have different attitudes toward the legacy of the Gulag. The Orthodox Church has canonized many priests who died in the camps, but avoids harsh assessments of the Soviet system. Other denominations speak more openly about the repression of believers. The tourist potential of former campsites is minimally exploited. Unlike Germany, where concentration camps have become memorial centers attracting millions of visitors, the Russian authorities are not developing dark tourism. Many historical sites remain abandoned. Sociological surveys show that Russians have mixed feelings about the legacy of the Gulag. The older generation often justifies the repression as necessary to strengthen the state, while young people are more critical but poorly informed about the facts. There is no consensus on this issue in society. Contemporary political processes in Russia sometimes demonstrate continuity with the practices of the Gulag. Political persecution, restrictions on freedoms, and the use of forced labor in prisons are all reminiscent of the totalitarian past. Human rights activists are sounding the alarm, but their voices are not always heard. Russia's economic model is largely based on the exploitation of natural resources that were developed during the Gulag era. Oil, gas, and metals are extracted in areas where prisoners once worked. This economic dependence on the legacy of the camps is hindering the country's modernization. Scientific research into the legacy of the Gulag in Russia is developing slowly due to political restrictions and a lack of funding. Many promising projects are being shut down, archives are being classified, and researchers are emigrating. This prevents a full understanding of the tragic past. International programs to study the Gulag are often implemented without the participation of Russian scientists due to political differences. This leads to one-sided research and hinders access to Russian archives and eyewitness accounts. The medical consequences of staying in the Gulag have not been sufficiently studied. Many diseases suffered by former prisoners and their descendants may be linked to the conditions of camp life, but no systematic research has been conducted. This deprives people of their right to compensation and treatment. What other hidden consequences of the Gulag affect modern Russia? And is it possible to completely overcome the legacy of totalitarianism? In the struggle between memory and oblivion that has been going on in Russian society for several decades, the stakes are incredibly high. The outcome of this confrontation will determine not only justice for the millions of victims of the Gulag, but also the future of Russia itself as a constitutional state. The first attempts to commemorate the victims of the Gulag began during the period of perestroika. Individual enthusiasts erected homemade monuments at mass burial sites, collected the memories of survivors, and created folk museums. The authorities viewed these activities with suspicion, but did not directly prohibit them. Anna Akhmatova, whose son spent many years in the camps, wrote, "No, not under a foreign sky, and not under the protection of foreign wings. I was then with my people, where my people, unfortunately, were." Her requiem became the first great poetic monument to the victims of repression. The Solovetsky stone, erected on Lubyanskaya Square in 1990, became a symbol of remembrance for the victims of political repression. Every year on October 29th, the Return of Names ceremony is held here, when the lists of those who were shot are read aloud. This ceremony has become an important ritual of national repentance. The International Society Memorial, created by Andrei Dmitrievich Sakharov and his colleagues, has become the largest organization dedicated to perpetuating the memory of the victims of the Gulag. Over the course of 30 years, Memorial has created a unique database of repressed individuals, collected tens of thousands of testimonies, and organized hundreds of commemorative events. The creation of memorial centers on the sites of former camps is proceeding extremely slowly and is meeting with resistance from local authorities. Many officials believe that the memory of repression damages the region's image and scares away investors. As a result, most campsites remain abandoned. Perm 36 was the first and, for a long time, the only museum of the history of political repression in Russia. Created on the basis of a preserved camp, it showed the real conditions of detention. However, in 2013, the museum was effectively destroyed, and its exhibition radically changed. The literary memorialization of the Gulag began with the publication of Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich in 1962. This was followed by The Gulag Archipelago, Shalomov's Kolyma Tales, and the memoirs of Yevgenia Ginsburg. These works became the basis for understanding the camp theme. Cinematic memory of the Gulag developed controversially. During the Soviet era, the topic was taboo, and in the 1990s, the first documentaries and feature films appeared, but they had limited distribution. Hollywood films about the Gulag often contain historical inaccuracies. The digitization of the memory of the Gulag has opened up new possibilities. Internet databases of repressed persons, virtual museums, and multimedia projects have been created. Social networks allow people to share family stories and find traces of repressed relatives. Educational programs on the history of the Gulag face resistance from conservative segments of society. Attempts to include this topic in the school curriculum are met with accusations of denigration and Russophobia. As a result, young people are poorly informed about the history of repression. International cooperation in memorializing the Gulag is developing actively. Joint projects have been created with Holocaust museums, centers for the study of totalitarianism, and human rights organizations. This helps to place the Russian experience in the context of 20th century world history. Religious memorialization of the victims of the Gulag has its own specific characteristics. The Orthodox Church has canonized hundreds of new martyrs, priests and lay people who died during the repressions. Memorial churches have been built, and memorial services are held. But the Church avoids political assessments of the Soviet system. Regional differences in attitudes toward the memory of the Gulag are very significant. In some regions, the authorities support memorial projects, while in others, they actively oppose them. This creates an uneven map of memory across the country. Genealogical research is becoming an important form of preserving memory. People are searching for traces of their repressed ancestors, reconstructing family histories, and creating family trees. The internet has made this work much easier, but many archives remain inaccessible. Artistic forms of memorialization include painting, sculpture, theater productions, and musical works. Monuments to the victims of repression have been created. Operas and symphonies have been written, and plays have been staged. Art helps to have an emotional impact on viewers. Opposition to memorialization takes various forms, from administrative obstacles to open aggression. Monuments are vandalized, museums are deprived of funding, and activists receive threats. This testifies to the incompleteness of the process of coming to terms with the past. The legal aspects of memorialization remain unresolved. Russia has no law on the rehabilitation of victims of political repression that comprehensively regulates issues of memory. Many initiatives exist in a legal vacuum and depend on the political situation. The economic problems of memorialization are linked to a lack of funding. The state allocates minimal funds to preserving the memory of the Gulag, private investors are not interested, and international grants are limited. As a result, many projects remain unrealized. The psychological aspects of working with traumatic memory require a professional approach. People who have encountered a family history of repression need psychological support. But there is a catastrophic shortage of specialists in working with historical trauma in Russia. Youth initiatives to preserve the memory of the Gulag are developing despite official indifference. Students are creating volunteer groups, organizing expeditions to former campsites, and conducting educational work on social media. Their enthusiasm gives hope for the future. Virtual reality technologies are opening up new opportunities for memorialization. Virtual tours of former camps, three-dimensional reconstructions of historical events, and interactive maps of repression have been created. These innovations make history more accessible to the younger generation. Comparative studies of memorialization in different countries reveal Russia's unique characteristics. While in Germany the memory of Nazi crimes has become the basis of national identity, in Russia, the attitude towards the Soviet past remains ambivalent. The future of Gulag memorialization depends on many factors: the political will of the authorities, the activity of civil society, international pressure, and generational change. The outcome of this struggle is still unclear, but the stakes are extremely high. The soul of the nation and its capacity for moral renewal are at stake. Will Russian society find the strength to fully comprehend the tragedy of the Gulag? Or will historical oblivion finally engulf the memory of millions of victims?